You are listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello, and welcome to Awake in Relationship. My name is Silas Rose. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, and I hope you are, I'm going to assume that you probably have some sort of contemplative or spiritual practice that helps to keep you sane and is part of your regular wellness routine. And that might be yoga or meditation, or it could be a little bit more adventurous. I know a lot of people that are really excited about psychedelic therapy right now and other forms of shamanic work. In the past few decades, there's really been an explosion of new forms of spirituality. Many people have been exiting traditional religious institutions in search of a more direct and personal approach to enlightenment. In this lonely world, it can really feel kind of intoxicating to find a spiritual home, a community that provides the safety and support to explore your deepest spiritual longing. For those fortunate enough to find a teacher, a spiritual master, intoxication grows into devotion, a meeting of minds and hearts. In many traditions, the teacher-student relationship is considered sacred because the teacher, a qualified teacher, can see through our bullshit and offer a glimpse into the ultimate view, our true nature beyond dualistic thought and ego clinging. However, within the bliss of devotion hides the potential of a poison pill that neither the student or the teacher are prepared to swallow. Great realization doesn't necessarily mean great emotional intelligence or the absence of a shadow. The shadow is a term coined by Carl Jung to describe the unconscious mind. It's the place where our deepest family secrets reside, our unmet desires, repressed emotions, and unexpressed gifts and talents. We often only become aware of the shadow when it's activated in intimate relationships, where issues around sexuality, power, and money come to the surface. Really, what is a spiritual path for, if not to bring to light these most hidden parts of ourselves? Yet so many spiritual communities are blindsided when allegations of clergy abuse or sexual misconduct are raised against a teacher. The rupture of trust really can bring into question the validity of one's own insights and wisdom. For the student, it really sets in motion a profound disillusionment and self-doubt that can be really hard to overcome. For the modern-day yogi or yogini, it's a remarkably common experience. It's an experience I know personally, as back in 2018, my own spiritual community blew up after reports of sexual misconduct were levied against my own teacher. So I want to invite onto the show someone that could speak to the importance of shadow work and healing on the spiritual path. Dr. Connie Zweig is the author of Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, the Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening. In this conversation, we talk about the archetypal longing that initially inspires us to seek out a teacher, and the disillusionment and heartbreak we might feel when we discover our teacher is actually human, with human fallibility. We also discuss some of the lessons learned from some of the more high-profile examples of misconduct among yoga and meditation communities in the West, and how to restore trust in the teacher-student relationship through integrating shadow work on the path to awakening in the modern world. Stay tuned. So, Connie, welcome to Awakened Relationship.
Thanks for having me, Silas.
I'm really curious about the personal inspiration for writing this book. Why write about the shadow and spirituality?
When I was 19, I was at school in Berkeley. I think it was 1969. And we were striking down the psychology department because they were killing animals. And I saw this really cute guy walking out of the building, long ponytail down to his butt. And I followed him. And we started talking, and we had this great connection. We walked all across Berkeley. And he would not go out with me unless I learned TM. So I went to the local meditation center and learned how to meditate, and found that my mind was quieting, my anger was dissipating, I was generally feeling better, and I got more and more involved with TM, eventually became a TM teacher. And in my 20s, that's really what my life was about. So now that's 50 years ago. But at the time, it was a very dramatic life change. And it was very much about, there was incredible knowledge being transmitted, lots of long meditation retreats, community and belonging, purpose and meaning, because when we taught meditation, we felt like we were opening the possibility of enlightenment to people. And then slowly that community became more hierarchical, more rigid, more financially demanding. And Maharishi, who was the teacher, had a number of sex scandals, even though he was telling people to be celibate. And so there was a lot going on that turned me off. I got discouraged and I left. And that separation was very painful because none of my friends would speak to me. I lost my purpose. I lost my sort of orientation in my life. And so years later, when I was in graduate school in depth psychology and studying Jung, I got really involved in exploring the shadow and the ways in which we form shadow in spiritual communities. And I wrote my dissertation on the holy longing, which is a poetic term for our spiritual yearning, our yearning for the divine, for transcendence, for non-duality. And so there was, way back then, this kind of link for me between spirituality and psychology, and trying to use depth psychology to understand spirituality. And eventually that became a book called The Holy Longing, which then became very outdated. And so I have written this very revised version post Me Too movement and all of the changes that humanity has gone through. That's called Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, the dance of darkness and light in our search for awakening. So, and this is my 6th book. So somehow I ended up spending my career exploring the shadow. And one of the books is about relationships. One is about sort of general everything in the shadow. And one is about aging in the shadow. And I hadn't really done spirituality again in the current climate, and also with what I've learned over all these years. So that's how this happened.
I think many of the people listening to this podcast are familiar with the term shadow. How do you define it, and how does it show up differently for individuals and for groups?
The shadow is a term that was coined by Carl Jung to refer to that part of us that holds the forbidden, unwanted, unwelcome traits, qualities, and behaviors that we learn as a child will not be rewarded with love and approval. Rather, they'll be shamed or punished or, told that they're taboo. So it could be our anger, our tears. It could be our talent for painting, if that's not approved of in a family. It could be our sexuality, or pretty much anything at all that doesn't fit into our family system and our parents and teachers and clergy's framework for what's acceptable. So it's not all bad. It's only bad in relation to ego. So the ego experiences it as bad and then represses it or stuffs it away in the body mind. So we used to think that the mind and body were separate and the shadow was like a little closet inside the brain. It's not like that. The mind and the body are functionally identical. Everything's working together. So the shadow material in the body, in the muscles, the nerves, in our whole system. In fact, it's in the subtle body. There's shadow material in every chakra as well. So every once in a while, that material gets triggered and it erupts. And so, a really peaceful person may go into a rage, or a really mellow person may fall into a depression, or someone in a midlife crisis may act out sexually by having an affair. Or so the reason that it's important to explore shadow content for each of us is that when it emerges, it sabotages our conscious intentions. It's not aligned. So if I say, for example, I'm going to finish writing this book by January 1st, and I don't do that, there's a part of me, I would call it the procrastinator, that sabotages that intention. Or you're in a relationship and you have an intention to be kind and to be a good listener, but what happens is all these critical comments come out of your mouth, and you have the same fight over and over again with your partner. So that's all the shadow emerging. So in our spiritual communities, we also develop a kind of persona, a spiritual persona, because we want to look good and get other people meditating or practicing or coming to this teacher. And so certain other material goes into the shadow. And so groups develop their own shadows. What's not acceptable in that group? With some groups, it might be sexuality. In other groups, that's acceptable. So each community or tribe also forms a persona and a shadow with the material that doesn't fit the socially acceptable persona. And our teachers are doing the same thing. So our teachers who may come from monastic cultures that have different mores and values, maybe they're sexist cultures, maybe they're celibate, maybe the teacher is told that he is really special as a lineage holder. And so he's bringing all of that material over to the postmodern Western culture, right? That's more about individuality and self-expression and more open sexuality. And there's this clash of cultures as well as of individual shadows that happens in this transplantation of teachers to the West.
One thing I find so perplexing is it's such a pervasive issue or problem here in the West, not only among the Catholic Church, but among contemplative traditions like yoga and, of course, Buddhism. What is the spiritual path for if not to bring out that material, to bring to the light, the darkness. Yet it always catches us by surprise.
Yes, that's correct. I think we sort of start out quite naive on the path, most people. If I pray enough or meditate enough or sit long enough, or I'm devoted enough to this teacher, it will just all be light and flowers from here on out. And so the denial of shadow is really epidemic. And for that reason, many of us continue to repress material in our spiritual relationships and our spiritual communities. We're not looking at our blind spots. We're not encouraged to do that. Rather, we're encouraged to keep that relationship in place. And again, it could be a priest parishioner. It could be a rabbi. It could be a shaman using plant medicine. I've had some terrible reports from those communities. It could be a Vedanta Swami. As you said, it could be a Roshi or a Buddhist teacher, a Lama or a Roshi. So, it's very non-denominational. And that's because we're human and human beings have shadows. And when we don't have training in how to work with our own shadow material, or I should say, and how to detect it in others, how to cultivate shadow awareness so that we can see red flags and know when it's dangerous for us. And I've had so many people say to me, my body was telling me it was dangerous and I didn't listen. So if we don't have that kind of training and cultivate that kind of awareness, along with pure awareness or pure consciousness, or whatever name we use for that, our Buddha nature, our Christ nature, our essence, if we don't, along with that, really cultivate this, our psychological awareness, then at some point on the path, it's fairly common that something will happen. We'll meet our own darkness or the darkness of the teacher or of the group, and we'll be shocked. And what I want to kind of tell people is, it doesn't mean when we meet the shadow, it doesn't mean we're off the path. This is part of the path in every tradition, whether we call it the dark night of the soul or the via negativa or whatever we call it. This is part of the path. And yet we have no guidance for it. And most teachers don't know what to do about it. They have no guidance for it. They have no moral development, no training in moral development. So chapter 5 of the book really tells a lot of stories about allegations against teachers and how they, even in advanced levels of consciousness, how they acted out their shadows and harmed people in this really sacred relationship. And then the second half of the book is about how to begin to recover from that. Many people suffer PTSD from these experiences. They suffer loss of faith and anxiety and depression. And other people are more resilient and they can become whistleblowers and they can learn to talk about what they observe or what they experience and really work to make changes in the groups in order to protect other people from having those experiences. So it's a very individual process. I'm not telling people what to do, whether to leave or not. But what I'm suggesting is, let's not be naive as we make these commitments. Let's be aware that there are psychological issues. Some people are looking for the perfect parent, and they project that onto the teacher. Some people are looking for belonging, an end to isolation and loneliness, and that's the most important thing to them. There are a lot of unmet childhood needs in these relationships. And at the same time, I mentioned our holy longing. That yearning for the divine is universal. There's nothing wrong with it. You know, all the poets talk about the soul's longing for the beloved. So this is not a bad thing to be a seeker. However, if we can learn to cultivate shadow awareness and use what I call shadow work to get through these, to work through these situations of abuse or trauma or betrayal, then we can become much more mature spiritual seekers. And that spiritual maturity, I think, is beginning to happen now as people become more aware of all of these scandals.
Your story is so kind of relatable for me, and almost kind of, I feel like there's something archetypal that we're kind of dialing into here, certainly with the holy longing, but really an understanding of the path. And I'll self-confess, like this is, I have personal experience with this. Back in 2018, my own spiritual community had a major rupture when my teacher had allegations of sexual misconduct levied against him. It was really kind of the height of the Me Too movement. I, like many others, were completely blindsided. And the whole process since, it's been about, 5 years, is this real feeling of disillusionment that something got damaged in the process of that kind of rupture. For me, it really kind of relates to that holy longing, because I feel the holy longing is very genuine. It's very powerful and also naive. It is like a child. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about that holy longing.
Well, I think it has different dimensions to it. So there's a childlike dimension. I can remember being, I think it was in junior high school, we called it, now I think it's middle school, longing for God and praying in my bed. My family was not religious. Nobody ever talked to me about doing that. I didn't go to Sunday school. But there was this part of me that was longing for something greater than myself, even at that young age. So there's that childlike part, but there's also, as you said, the archetypal part. What is our image of the divine? What images do we carry unconsciously in the shadow of God's? And how do we relate to those images? How do we long for them, imagine our relationship to them? Carl Jung wrote a lot about the image of God in his clinical practice and how people would talk about their restlessness for something more. And then they would and then finally they would come up with an image that was the object of their longing. And it wasn't just apparent and unconditional love. It was something divine. Maybe it was an image of a divine human. Maybe it was a mandala or a light or an om, or, depending on the lineage, or an image of kind of an almighty God. And so that's the archetypal component of the holy longing that, as you say, is very genuine. And what happens when it lands, that projection lands on a human being? And we imagine that he or she is self-realized and compassionate and perfect. So what I've come to understand is there are no perfect human beings. And that even men and women who have attained high levels of non-duality still may have shadow material stuck in the sex chakra, stuck in the power chakra, or they may have lack of conscience I mean, when you read the stories in the book, you can only conclude that some of them are extremely narcissistic. And they're so self-centered that they feel immune to the consequences of their actions. They don't feel empathy for the person they're harming. And so there are kind of many layers to this. And from that teacher's point of view, that clergy person who's acting out that way, what's going on in his or her psychology? What is he? Many teachers are isolated. They don't have peer support. They land in the West without cultural training. They haven't had moral development in their cultures of origin or their families, right? And so and then they're suddenly adored. They're adored, not just admired, right? They're adored by hundreds or maybe millions of people. In India, some teachers are adored by millions of people. And so what happens when you carry that much projection about being perfect and nobody knows you? Nobody really knows who you are because you're idealized. And it's that idealized image that people see. They don't see your humanity. This is very isolating. I mean, this is not an enviable position to be in from my point of view. So there's a dynamic then. There's this naive seeker or believer who's projecting that. And then there's this receiver of all that projection who's carrying it, maybe for years. And so what happens when he loses his temper, or he gets depressed, or he feels isolated, or he feels depressed? He can't show that, right? Or he has sexual urges, but his lineage is celibate. And so there's a lot of risk going both ways in this dynamic.
That's actually a very compassionate way of looking at it, because it's so easy just to dismiss the teacher, and I think I have kind of two questions there. One is really about personal recovery as a student, but the second question is really about how does the teacher recover, especially post-Me Too, and I think the cancel culture of the day really doesn't, I think the shadow of that is that it doesn't allow for a path back or redemption.
So there are very few teachers who are open to looking at this and trying to recover, because if you want to recover, you recognize you've done something wrong, or that there's something about you that's acting out unconsciously, harmfully, right? There's very few examples of this. So I give a few of them in the book. Yogi Amrit Desai, who founded the Kripalu Yoga Center, was married and was found to be having an affair. First, he denied it with a student, and then another student came forward, and so he admitted both of the sexual affairs. And he took on learning about the psychological dimension of what had happened. And he and Kripalu brought in consultants and therapists. They worked to redesign the community. Initially, he thought he could stay, but eventually he left. And the community was really reimagined to be not guru-centered. Brew Joy, who was a physician who became a healer and then a teacher, actually wrote a book about his own experience of being a teacher and falling off the pedestal. And so I tell that story. And there's a community in LA, the LA Zen Center, that had another sexual scandal with the Roshi, who was, I think he was like 100 years old at the time, and first denied he was having sex with female students, and then eventually it all came out. And after he left, a female Roshi took over, and she redesigned everything from top to bottom, because the systems that are patriarchal are colluding with the abuse and colluding with the man in power, if it's a man. And so she redesigned, in fact, she had people sit zazen, that's normally done facing the wall. She had them face each other. She taught them shadow work and how to communicate. She redesigned the male-female dynamic. So that was a very beautiful story about recovery and renewal. But, and there may be more. I know that Andrew Cohen has really, fallen from grace and is now on a book tour trying to make amends with people he hurt. And those are really the only examples that I know of teachers who've taken on trying to repair what they've done. For students or parishioners or believers to do individual shadow work, that's what the second half of the book is about. So it's really to begin to explore what we lose in the projection onto a teacher. What are we giving away to the teacher that we're then stuffing into our own shadow? So if we're giving away compassion, this is the most compassionate person, on the planet, and I can only be that way if I stay with her, then we're not acknowledging our own capacity for compassion, and that goes into our shadows. It's not lived out because it's given away. If we give away the light or the essence or the consciousness or the whatever we call it, then we're not trying to cultivate that in ourselves. Recognizing that that is who we are, we're only seeing it outside of ourselves, right?
So often the teacher is in a position or put in a position where they confer that.
When we're trained as psychologists and therapists and we're taught about projection and how to carry the projection, if we have really good training, we learn when to find the moment to give it back in order to empower the client. These teachers are not doing that as far as I know. They may talk about it. I mean, Muktananda talked about it, but they don't actually give it back and say to the student, unless the student has some experiences of awakening, and then they say, okay, go out and teach, which has happened, in some of these communities. But mostly they don't give back in a very clear way that capacity that they've been carrying, that power and authority and spiritual light that they've been asked to carry. They don't really return it to the students. Why? Because most of them want to stay in power. They want to stay on their golden throne. They want to stay adored. They want the money coming in. There are a lot of stories about financial abuse. Someone just told me this week that when she started with her teacher, he asked for tithing, small amounts of money. And then he asked for a portion of people's income. And then he asked for people's estates when their families died. He wanted the land or the house or the estates. And that's financial abuse or coercion, whatever we want to call it, So some of this is subtle and very covert, and some of it's really overt like that, Well, if you want to stay with me in this relationship and be a special follower, then you have to turn over your parents' estate to me. So, and in terms of coming back to the recovery process, there are several other parts of it. We need to recover our critical thinking because some of us have been instructed that to ignore the mind, thoughts are empty and they're not important. And so we ignore the doubts. We ignore the questions. The questions are not respected. Reclaim our authentic feelings. So whatever feelings have been stuffed away, what would happen if we began to just let them arise a little bit, even just a little bit, whether it's fear, anger, anxiety, whatever it is, and reclaiming our agency to act on our own behalf, whether that means separating from the teacher or whether it means staying and asking more questions, maybe even becoming a whistleblower in some situations and taking the risk that's involved in that. It's very scary for people to speak up in these situations. There's so much, it's like an alcoholic family that's holding secrets about abuse. And it's the secrets that glue the whole system together. And so it's difficult to speak up. And even in some lineages, you take a vow not to do that. You actually take a vow not to question your teacher. So, and then I would also say reclaiming our images of the divine, becoming aware of what's typically unconscious that we're imagining that we're longing for. What does that look like? And does it fit who we are now?
So if you were to imagine a new form of spirituality in the West, a mature form, what would that look like?
Oh, that's a huge question, Silas. I don't have a single answer. I think we're in the process, really. Many millions of people are becoming unchurched. They're leaving traditional Christianity and they're searching for something new. Many other people are becoming more fundamentalist, whether in Judaism or Christianity or Islam or the Eastern religions. It's kind of going both ways. I think one of the paradoxes that's interesting is how many people are having experiences of awakening while we're in the middle of all these really extreme interconnected crises that we're facing around climate and democracy and gun violence and poverty and hunger. That's like a really interesting moment. So what is that about? I mean, a new spirituality from my point of view would include psychological or shadow awareness. So, Catholic priests would be trained not just in the morality of the Bible, but in how to have conscience around their own sexuality. And Eastern teachers would have some kind of community and peer support to be able to look at their own issues and not be ashamed of their own flaws and vulnerabilities. I'm part of a group called Association for Spiritual Integrity, which is trying to do this. We meet once a month. We have webinars and discussions with a lot of people who are both seekers and teachers. Some of the new young teachers who are coming out and working online. And so we're trying to assist them with this missing piece in their development. You probably know Ken Wilber's idea about lines of development. Well, it's about, awakening is not global. You can wake up without becoming a musician or without becoming really an excellent communicator in relationships or without becoming Einstein, right? So the spiritual line of development is separate from cognitive development, emotional development, creative development, and also moral development. So ethics and morals don't automatically come to people when they wake up. And I think that this is extremely important for people to understand who want to both step into the position of teacher and also step into the position of a devotional relationship with someone, and to kind of and to ask, or at least watch and see if there's moral development there, if there's some kind of ethical, and there may be precepts that are intellectual. A lot of Insight Society has their precepts, and a lot of yoga has the yamas and niyamas, but these people are not living out their precepts because their shadows are erupting.
He talks about, waking up, growing up, and then cleaning up.
So the cleaning up is what I've kind of focused my career on. And Ken teaches shadow work in a different way than I do. I've talked about it endlessly. But, this is, for me, really essential to creating a new kind of spirituality, especially if we're going to continue to have a teacher-student dynamic. Some people want to get rid of that altogether, and redesign communities that are not in the guru model.
If it's not too personal, I'm kind of curious, what is your own relationship to spirituality now?
I usually don't talk about it, and I'll tell you why. Because people tend to imitate. And my lineage and practices are not what somebody else, what is right for somebody else. So I've had other disappointing experiences since that early one in my 20s with teachers. One of them was in India with a highly advanced adept who had lived all his life on the streets as a sannyasin. And he had no relationship skills, and he was really mean to me, contemptuous and sexist. I had another experience with someone who I'm convinced is extremely high, that was about money. And it was heartbreaking. It was really heartbreaking. So, my husband and I have our practices that we do. We're not involved with a teacher at the moment. We kind of feel I've had a lifelong alignment with two lineages, depth psychology and Vedanta. But I don't have a teacher.
Well, this is probably a good place to land the conversation. It's a great book and just such important work that you do. So thank you so much, Connie. And people want to connect more. Where can they go?
Well, as Silas knows, I'm organizing free online groups to do spiritual shadow work for people who want to read the book in community and go through the practices and the recovery process together. So if you are interested in that, you can shoot me an email, Connie Zweig, Zweig, @gmail.com. Just put spiritual shadow work in the subject line and give me your time zone, and I'll connect you with other people. There are many, many groups forming now all over the world, so that's really gratifying for me. I would ask that you don't send me a long email with your history, because I just have too much email coming in. But I'd be happy to connect you with people in your area if you are interested in this. If you're interested in workshops or other interviews, you can check out conniezweig.com.
Well, thank you again, and have a great summer.
I'm glad we found each other, Silas. Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed this conversation with Connie. Her perspective is nuanced and empathetic. I hope to bring her back at some point in the future to talk more about the shadow. If you want to learn more about Connie's work, head over to conniezweig.com, and that's Zweig as ZWEIG.com. I'll be sure to put a link into the show notes at awakenrelationship.com. If you found value in this conversation, maybe it moved you in some way, I'd appreciate a quick review on Apple or Spotify. It really helps me to grow the show. As always, I can be found on the socials, Instagram, Substack, and LinkedIn. Please send me a note. Let me know what you thought about the show. I really love hearing from my audience. And I'm always open to new suggestions for topics and guests. If you made it this far into the episode, I really want to thank you, dear listener, for tuning in. Till next time, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.